Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, which was named by Poets and Writers a best book for writers. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed. And today I am so delighted to have Kate Washington with us. She is the author of Midstream, A Life Remade in 50 Swims, and we're going to get into it. But first, a little bit about Kate. She's the author of Already Toast and a frequent speaker about her experience as a caregiver. Her creative nonfiction, essays, and long-form work have appeared in the New York Times, Time, HuffPost, and many other outlets. She lives in Sacramento. Connect with her at kawashington.com. And welcome to the program, Kate.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I loved reading Midstream for so many reasons. One, it is Memoir Plus, so it's your life. It has a stream of narrative nonfiction throughout where you give information and history, but it's framed around important life experiences. So can you just give a little synopsis of what it's about?
Sure. So, Midstream is framed around a challenge that I undertook in the run up to my 50th birthday. I'm now 53, so this was a few years ago, but I was facing down the milestone birthday, kind of unhappy, feeling stuck in my life, burnt out for reasons that I detail in my first book and also in this book. And I decided to do a challenge of going to 50 different natural bodies of water to swim or dip before my 50th birthday. I called it the 50 Dunks Challenge. And I didn't think of it as something that I would write a book about. But along the way, I learned a lot about new ways to live and made a lot of change in my life. And when that was complete and I was looking back on it, I realized there was a lot there to say and more that I wanted to say about that challenge. I live in California. It was very based in the natural world around me. So there's a lot of nature writing. There's a lot of other reflection on women's lives at midlife. And all of that, I think, comes out in Midstream.
Yeah, and it's such a great title because it pulls in the element of water, and then mid because you're dealing with all these changes in midlife, from your marriage to your self-esteem to your physicality to bringing back something from childhood that you loved, swimming. How did you come up with the title?
Well, in the development of this book, it actually had a completely different title up until I was pretty deep in the writing of it. The original title was Watersheds, which played on the idea of exploring different watersheds and of a watershed moment in your life. But in discussions with my publisher, with my editor, it was felt that that might have too much of a kind of scientific or sound like a hydrology textbook. So I was really kind of at a loss for a new title for a long time. We'd actually come pretty close to deciding on the subtitle, which also changed in development. We tossed around a lot of ideas, had a couple of brainstorming meetings, and I was like, oh God, I really don't know. Watersheds was my idea. And originally the structure of the book was also built around different watersheds that I was going to, but it didn't map neatly onto the book as I was writing it. And one day, midstream just popped into my head. Actually, I was getting a massage when it popped into my head. So it was a very embodied experience of my brain was turned off, and all of a sudden it just came to me. And then we all really liked the title. And I think it's been a great fit for the book.
You use the framing of the 50 Dunk Project, the swims. But unlike, I guess, your original iteration, you were going to just do the swim and what it meant and all that, you wove in so much. You added in things about science and about the importance or the impact on the body of cold plunge and all sorts of historical and relevant information that ties in beautifully with the story. So, how did you decide to, after the initial idea turning down of how to do it this way?
Well, I had always intended to weave in outside material. That's actually what I do in my first book to an even greater degree. I would say it's very much reported memoir with a lot about the sociological and cultural impact of caregiving is the focus of that book. And this book has, I think, a lighter touch. It's a less serious, less dire subject, but really I just wove in the things that I was interested in about each dunk and each swim and like necessary context for some of my experience. There's kind of a little tiny smattering of feminist philosophy and the cultural position of women, especially at midlife, that I thought was important context for some of the things I was experiencing and that I hoped would help other people kind of jump in, as it were. But the nature writing and the more scientific part, a lot was to do with making it so the dunks and the swims didn't feel quite so repetitive. I also worked really hard on incorporating sensory detail about each one, but many of them were in California. And, I described rocks and trees and water. Those are very similar to people who don't know the terrain. And so I needed to kind of come up with ways to distinguish each swim from each other. I did a lot of picking and choosing about which ones I would talk about. I went to all 50 places in my real life and I wrote little blog entries about all of them back when I was first doing it. But I didn't include all of them in the book because that would have been very repetitive and I feel not of interest to read. So a big part of shaping the narrative was choosing what to leave out.
Interesting. When I read a book, I read to the end, to the acknowledgments, and you mentioned Pam Houston, who I just idolized. I read Cowboys Are My Weakness years ago and just loved it. And you posed a question to her that you said really helped you in the writing of the book. And that was how, when you're doing something that has repetitive elements to it, such as many different swims that you're doing in memoir form, how do you make it stand out? And you say that she gave you the answer and it really helped you. Now I'm asking you, and I have an idea, but what did she tell you?
Yeah, so I was really fortunate to be in a brief residency that she was leading in France when I was finishing this book and coming to the end and a little bit stuck. She had kind of office hours every evening to talk about craft issues. Another writer asked about creating pattern in memoir. And I was really interested in that question, but I was like, my problem is that I have too much pattern. This can be repetitive. And so, what do you do if you have pattern, but you want it to be engaging as opposed to repetitive and dull for the reader? And her suggestion was, in my case, because I was working with water, to look at the container of the water, to look at the hydrology more, to look at the shape of the streams or the lakes or the riverbeds or the oceans and think about that. And she mentioned a lot of different kinds of natural bodies of water at that point. And some of them were things that I had already engaged with in the initial draft, but some were kind of new and gave me ideas for new kinds of metaphor and ways to talk about the water and the terrain and the landscape, which I think she's so wonderful at writing. I first got Cowboys Are My Weakness when I was in college, and it had a big impact on me. I was a girl from the West in college on the East Coast, and it made me homesick. It really struck me and stayed with me. So it felt really meaningful to get that piece of advice that kind of broke open a little bit of block I'd had about finishing the book.
I love that because you mentioned metaphor and the ways of connecting information. You do it so beautifully. You tie in the different natural elements with the emotional implications of what's going on in your life. So, really, anybody who's working on memoir can look at what the overall focus of the work is and then find different iterations of that. Did you do any mind mapping? Did you kind of do graphing or anything like that? Or was it more organic?
It was a little more organic, I would say. I wrote pretty much from start to finish. This book was sold on proposal. I didn't have a full draft, but I had kept these blog pieces that I didn't share with anybody. It wasn't even really a public blog. I mean, people could stumble on it, but I don't think anybody did based on the very low number of hits that the initial blog got. I was just doing the creative writing about the dunks for myself, and they were very much casual, tossed off kind of journal entries. So I had those materials to work with. And I began at the beginning and wrote through more or less to the end. But then at the end, when I was revising, the big project of revision ended up being cutting. And I ended up cutting probably 20,000 words from the draft in the last 6 weeks before delivering the manuscript.
How did you make those decisions for revision? Like, what was it that calls out to you that this has to go?
I looked very carefully for repetition, and what I found was this book brings in a lot of different themes from my life. As you mentioned, it's in part a divorce memoir, it's in part a nature memoir, it's self-reclamation, there's a parenting element. And sometimes I found that I was circling back around to some of those themes a little too much, or I was repeating parts of my life in different parts of the narrative. And part of that came about because when I did the dunks, I went back to some bodies of water at different times. You know, the whole project took a year and a half to do the swims. And so I kept being tempted to shoehorn in, oh, I went to this swimming hole the previous year. And so I found that I had both repetition and also kind of bouncing around in time chronologically in a way that I thought would be confusing for readers. And one of my readers pointed out that it was a little confusing for readers. So I imposed a really strict timeline on myself where the only flashbacks in the narrative would be to outside the time frame of the dunks themselves. So I talk about material from, childhood. This took place in 2021 and 2022. So if I was in a chapter that was taking place in July 2022, I wasn't going to go back and talk about August 2021 or vice versa. I wasn't going to flash forward. I wanted to keep that very strictly chronological. So that helped me strip away things. Just setting that rule helped me strip away things. And then also taking out a lot of the telling, putting a lot of things more into scene, showing what was happening, and including a lot of sensory detail, which became a really guiding principle in the revision was, does this show how it felt for me? Is it helping readers maybe feel like they could be there in the water with me? And if it wasn't, it got cut.
I like that idea that you kept that forward momentum with the chronology, but the flashbacks were able to then be inserted. How did you connect the flashbacks to the movement in the scene or in the story each time? Did you have a guiding principle for doing that?
I would say that was more organic and less of a one to one, but I did start, reading. And as I was revising, I was really reading with an eye to like, am I getting in the weeds of this flashback? Has it gone on for more than a page or two so that the reader forgets where we are in the present moment, so that I, as the writer, forget where we are in the present moment? So I really tried to keep the braid, as it were, of the narrative pretty tight and, move back and forth between those fairly often so that that momentum continued, as you say.
In terms of the Memoir Plus, you are putting a lot into it. It's your relationship with Brad, your sex life, how it all unravels, how the caretaking aspect that you wrote about in your first book, but even taking it a little further because now you're connecting that to your search for freedom or leisure. You even put in research that shows that women have less of that type of time, that time to themselves. How did you, in selling it, because you have so many ideas in here, how did you keep it straight or keep it focused or help sell it? Because you sold it on proposal.
I mean, I was fortunate that both of my books are with Beacon Press. And so I was very fortunate that Beacon, they had the right of first refusal for my second proposal. And fortunately, they liked it and they do a lot of serious nonfiction. And in some ways, I was worried this might not be serious enough for them because my first book was much more engaged with kind of a social justice type of issue around caregiving. And this one's a little lighter. I love how they played with that in the design and the cover, in a lot of different decisions about the editing and then the marketing. Once a graduate student, always a graduate student. I have a PhD in literature, and so my tendency is to put in sources, and my what I have to do is stop myself from going overboard with research. But I included the main issues that I wanted to engage with, most of which centered on the situation of women at midlife. The fact that for many of us, we have come through the storms of parenting young children or marriage, building our careers, building our families, whatever choices we've made, and then kind of look around and it's like, I've given everything over to other people or to other parts of my life. What happened to me? And that was the kind of central question that guided what else I included. I was going back to parts of my life that I hadn't revisited in a long time because of other people's needs and my failure to engage with my own needs, honestly. And so that was a big kind of guiding principle, I think, in what I included in the book and in the proposal as I was framing it.
And I'm glad that you mentioned the literary aspects because I love that you put in about Lucy in a room of her own and other pieces from literature, from movies. And I was just looking when you started talking about how they made it come to life in the cover. This is just such a powerful image. When you saw this, what did you think when you first saw this?
I was very nervous about the cover design, in part because it is a very like California Western outdoors book, and the publishing industry is on the East Coast, and East Coast rivers and oceans and everything look very different. When I opened the file, the JPEG of the initial cover design, I gasped out loud. I was so happy. And I was so thrilled with the innovation of making the T the swimmer. In fact, I've had both stickers and temporary tattoos made up of the swimmer figure to give out as little swag at readings and things like that. I also really loved that they made the design of the two covers of my two books. They look kind of siblings a little bit on the shelf next to each other. There's some similarity with the colors, and they really nailed it on the photo. That looks like one of the places I swam. So it probably is one of the places I swam.
You also have many pages of notes. Can you talk about the process of accruing these notes and how you did it throughout?
The notes really go back to my academic training much more than my reporting training in journalism. And my first book had formal endnotes with page numbers. This book has notes, but they're the running note styles. That was my vision from the start, was like, we'll have notes and we'll have sources, but it won't look like it on the page. It's for interested readers to turn to the back. And similarly, I have an appendix where the book doesn't go through all 50 of the dunks, but for curious readers, there is an appendix that lists them all and gives the locations and where I was and the dates for all of them. I wanted it to be clearly sourced, but I wanted it to wear that sourcing kind of lightly.
Yeah, and it definitely does that. And it has so many different elements. Kate, this is such a great discussion, but what I would really love is if my listeners and viewers could hear a bit of your book. And I was wondering if you could read from page 155, ending that chapter.
Yes, I'd love to. And this is from toward the end of the book. And I'll just set the scene a little bit by saying that, The book has gone through a lot of challenges with both my daughters. They were teenagers. So this kind of is a little coming together at the end, and I'd love to read it. I went looking for water in the upper reaches of Big Chico Creek, which runs through Chico and forms the backbone of its enormous semi-wild city park. The creek rises northwest of Jonesville. That's a spot where my family and I have a very rustic little cabin. And its streams flow together at the site of a big Boy Scout camp no more than 15 minutes from the cabin. The topo map showed a large pear-shaped pond, almost a lake, in the middle of camp, dammed for recreation. I hoped to find the camp empty so I could sneak in for a swim. The camp was deserted but gated, and extended trespassing looked difficult, so we kept driving. Around a bend, a stand of leafy, apple-green willows made a bright splash in the muted grays and olives of the forest. Willows mean water, so I pulled over. A surprising hand-painted sign nailed to a tree read, "No hunting muskrats." I'm not sure muskrats even live in the area, but there was no caution against trespassing. Below lay a turbid black pool fed by a long culvert that flowed into a tangle of Queen Anne's lace and weeds, fringed by the brushy willows and with a steep slope lined by loose rocks. The pool wasn't quite swimmable, but the water came up nearly to my shoulders at the deepest spot. It felt magical, like a hidden fairy pool. Nora watched me from the bank, ever cautious. "I'd probably feel better if I went in," she said, doubt plain in her voice. "It's very refreshing," I said, still standing hip deep. I didn't want to push her. Cold water was my thing, but it's not for everyone. She stood considering. "I want to," she said. "It just looks so cold." She extended a hand as I pulled myself up onto the muddy bank. "I'm going to do it," she said. "After all, I've never seen you come out of the water without a smile on your face." Her words gave me a shiver unrelated to the bracing water. My 17-year-old daughter might have known me better than I knew myself. She certainly knew herself far better than I knew myself at 17, or even at 30. Her boundaries were solid, her sense of self secure. On that day, I started to see the glimmerings of our adult relationship. It was partly that we were sharing the love of water and the outdoors, but even more, it was that she saw me not just as mom, but as a full person. After the tension and anger of recent months, that felt as magical as a spring, a headwaters from which our life as mother and daughter could flow. I watched her pick her way down the treacherous rocks of the bank, and I thought of my recent rock scrambles at the spot. That's the subject of earlier in the chapter. This outing was a lot more modest. It might not even rise to the level of an adventure. Even though it lacked thrills, however, this dip brought the same solace and immersion in the moment as any time in nature and water. Nora's elbows squeezed her goosebumped waist as she eased into the chill. Then she was under, coming up spluttering and laughing, flipping her long hair in a rainbow of flying drops. We both went in again, and we both came out with smiles.
It's so lovely. Did you choke up a little at
A
the
little
end?
bit, yes, yes. I'll also say that Nora, she is now 21 and an art student, and she took my headshot.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So, yeah, there I am. Yes, and so that's near the American River near our house in Sacramento. And I'll also say about that passage that I mentioned earlier that late in revisions I cut an entire chapter, and that passage is the only piece that I kept from the chapter I cut. And so I combined it with the preceding chapter because that scene was really important to me and like the way the narrative unfolded. But the rest of that chapter had been repetitive. It was a lot about family history, personal history. It's based around my hometown. And I realized that I was rehashing a lot that I'd had in chapter one. And so I cut almost all of it except for that scene.
It's really a moment where the unifying principle of the book, water, brings the two of you together, which is just so beautiful. And the way that you end that chapter, that you're both smiles, it really encapsulates the moment. And I think that's Pam Houston's, concept in action,
I
right?
hope so. Yes.
Using the water, using the scene to keep the forward momentum of the story, because we're certainly in a different place with the two of you at the end of that scene and chapter than we were before.
Yeah.
Is there any part of writing the book that really, really scared you? And I'm wondering if also was it anything connected to how other people might view it.
Oh, terrifying. Like so much of it was so scary. It was scary to write about my choice to separate from and ultimately divorce somebody I'd cared for years, and any long marriage is complicated and has its various issues. But I really worried about the judgment of after he was so sick, how could she do that? And there are scenes also where I do not come out looking good. And I really worked hard on the principle of, as a memoirist, being harder on yourself than you are on other people. It was really scary to write about my daughters and to not know how they would take it because I'm dealing with conflict that we had and challenges that we had. And also, they have their own story to tell, and they went through a lot with how extraordinarily sick their dad was for most of their childhoods. He's lives independently, does well. We share parenting half time of our one daughter who's still at home. But it was scary to think of like, what if I just reopen all those old wounds by writing this? My daughters both came to my launch party and they both started reading the book at the after party part. And then I did not give them the opportunity to read it prior to publication. They both stayed up until midnight finishing it. And then my 17 or my almost 17-year-old sent me a text that was a good book with a thumbs up emoji.
That's high praise. I have a 17-year-old daughter.
Yes. So
That's high praise from a teenager.
yeah, so that was really gratifying. That scariness of exposing myself and exposing them hadn't caused a further rift or further challenges. I've done, kind of a lot of work on repair. So on a personal level, those things were really scary. It's also just scary to write about the life of the body. It's still kind of taboo. I don't write a huge amount about sex like in any explicit way, but there's a lot of metaphor and discussion of the life of coming back into being a more embodied person is really, to me, ultimately the plot and the arc of this book. When I set out to write it, I thought it would be more strictly a divorce memoir. And it was like, oh no, this is a self-rediscovery memoir. The divorce is just a side effect of that, or just something that had to happen along the way because the marriage really wasn't working. Sometimes I wish, as a memoir writer, that there could be like a force field where only strangers could read and know about the book, but unfortunately, we do not live in that world.
Yeah. So if somebody is starting to write their story, wants to make it Memoir Plus, what would your advice be? What should they do?
Honestly, I think if you want to write Memoir Plus, follow what's interesting to you. Be curious about the parts of your story that have another element. With both of my books are Memoir Plus, and in neither of them did I kind of say, like, I am going to write a memoir with other things in it. It was more like, these are the quirky parts of this story, especially in the case of Midstream. These are the quirky, very personal things. Will anybody else be interested in the way hydraulic mining affected my favorite swimming holes on the South Yuba River in an obscure part of Northern California? Maybe not, but I'm interested. That's a little bit jokey, but I think the writing advice around memoir of the more specific and personal you make something, the more universal it is. And if you're truly interested and passionate about something, that will come through and be of interest to readers. Some of my favorite books I've ever read, some of my favorite big stories I've ever read. In fact, I'm thinking of a lot that are ultimately about water or geology or hydrology. I think of like the writer John McPhee, the nonfiction writer who wrote for The New Yorker for many, many years and has wonderful books, who makes geology fascinating. And it was not something I ever would have thought I would have been interested in, but some of my favorite books are about these subjects. Because the writer is so confident and interested, I'm interested in following wherever they're going to take me. With Already Toast, there were kind of three strands to that. There was my personal story, there was the more reported journalistic facts and figures about caregiving in the US and why it's a crisis. And then there was a literary cultural criticism theme. And that was following like my old interest. I got a PhD in Victorian literature, and that comes through in Midstream as well. And really early on, when I was writing the proposal for Already Toast, I went to like a writing conference and where you could meet with agents. They could take a quick look at your synopsis. And I got one who advised me, this will never sell with this literary thing. You've got to drop the literary thing. It's not saleable. I was like, I don't care. That's my book. I mean, I didn't say that to her. That ended up resonating with readers. And I think it's because it was an expression of me, and the memoir is an expression of me. But I think that following what you really care about as you're setting out to write your story is the only way to go, because otherwise it has that feeling of something that gets tacked on.
I love that. And so when you were putting it in proposal, did you put explicitly each section, like this is going to be the studies I'm going to mention, this is going to be the other parts of the research, or it wasn't that way?
In some cases, yes. In some cases, there was a little more research woven into the chapter, the sample chapters, certainly, or the chapter synopses and the overview. But there were also things that I added or surprised myself with, or that I didn't know I was going to include as I was writing the full manuscript. For instance, there's a chapter late in the book that's set in France where I go on a big solo trip and I write about swimming in the Mediterranean, and I learned something about enormous Mediterranean flood millions of years ago just by talking to somebody about that chapter. And he was saying like, "Oh, this happened." I was like, "Oh, I'm going to go read about that." And then it kind of made its way just in a side reference as I was writing about swimming in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, you have so many different scenes. I mean, one of them we come upon a nudist colony, right? And they're just like so many different elements. You meet different people along the way, you meet tourists, and they're impressed by what you're doing. But all along the way, that through line of the change through the water, the freedom of you having that leisure time is what takes us along on that journey. What's next for you?
I really don't know in terms of writing. I'm working on a bunch of standalone essays, some of which were things that didn't end up fitting into the book. So I'm working on various pieces. I do not have a next book project in mind. My books came out almost exactly 5 years apart, and each of them, it turned out, dealt largely with a time period that was 5 years prior. Artie Toast came out in 2021, and it's writing mainly about 2015, 2016. And this one just came out and it's about 2021 and 2022. So ask me in 5 years, maybe, because it takes a while to develop that. I don't know if I have another major memoir in me, but also right now it is river season and swimming season in California. And so I'm taking some days off to go to some new to me and old favorite places. I still do it. This wasn't just a project for the book. I'm still like going out to swim as much as I can.
That's so great. Kate, this has been such a great discussion. Everyone midstream, pick it up. You'll learn so much. And especially if you're going through midlife, any kind of change at all, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, and really we're humans. So who isn't? So it's for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.